everyone and welcome to Masterclass. I am woman Grandmaster Thalia Cervantes, and today I wanted to show off two games on how to carry out an attack. The different steps that you go through from opening to middle game to the conclusion of the attack, creating weaknesses on the opponent's position, and how it can happen in your games. I have two examples from two games of mine from different years, different points in time, where thankfully I managed to carry out some really nice attacks against my opponents. So we're going to dissect the different elements that make for these attacks successful. So the first game is from a tournament that is very memorable to me. It's the Canadian Transnational 2023. It was a very exciting event. We played the Rapid and Blitz portion in Toronto, and then we had a one-day break and we transported ourselves to Montreal. And then in Montreal, we played the classical portion of the tournament. And this was round 3 of that event. It was extremely strong, about 60 players, maybe 20 grandmasters, so you were always playing up. And in round 3, I was playing an opponent about 100 points higher rated than me. But let's see how the game went on. So we started out with d4, d5, c4, e6, knight to c3. It looks like a queen's gambit decline, but really quickly with this triangle, it transposed into a semi-Slav. e3 I played, knight to f6, knight to f3. I just chose to go for this setup. I'll quickly mention, actually, there's a very interesting line with e4. You can expand on this if you would like. But there is a line with e4, and then d takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop to b4 check, bishop to d2, queen takes d4, bishop takes b4, queen takes e4. And basically white is down a pawn, but there's plenty of compensation because of this bishop in the really strong diagonal. In the future, there are some ideas. Once you block, like either with the bishop or with the knight, I believe my files had bishop e2, but there are some ideas with bringing the queen over to d6 and putting even more pressure into this diagonal. So if you're wanting to play something a little bit more risky, maybe consider this. I, at the time, didn't really feel the need to because I transposed into a semi-Slav, which I already played. But e3 was played, knight f6, knight f3, knight d7, bishop to d3. And the idea with bishop to d3 is that I'm setting up for this e4. So I'm basically kind of forcing my opponent to commit to d takes e4. The downside is that I already moved my bishop twice, right? So if I want to expand in the center, I have to be quick with it. And my opponent played b5. I've moved my bishop for the third time. Bishop to d3, and after a6. In this particular moment, I played with castles, and this looks like a very natural move. There's nothing wrong really with castling right now, but as I said, it makes more sense to go for the control of the center right away. And the main line in this variation would be with e4, and there are ideas with c5, c5, e5, and c takes d4, knight takes b5. There are ideas with this in the position. So this is just if you by any chance want to take a look at this variations, feel free to. In the game, I played a little bit more tame, and this ended up causing, this could have caused some problems in the position because after a6 castles, my opponent played with c5. And c5 is a move that makes a lot of sense. Why? Because it's already putting pressure here on the center. This bishop has not committed just yet. So if I were to take here, first of all, taking with knight looks really good. Taking with bishop also looks great because the king's going to castle next. And it's difficult to tell where my advantage has gone because ideally I would want to play d4. I would want to have the pawns on d4 and e4 without any challenge, right? But in this particular moment, c5 is already on the board. This bishop is coming to b7, putting pressure into the diagonal near my king. So already I have to make some decisions. I decided to play with a4, putting pressure on this pawn right here on b5. b4 was played, and now knight to e4. And in my head, this all made a lot of sense because I created a weakness. I played a4, costing b4. And after the knight goes over to e4, if knight takes, bishop takes, I'm putting pressure onto this rook right here. Yes, but my opponent had a very strong move here. If you were playing with the black pieces, what would you consider? Maybe I should flip the board so that you can take a look, but there are a lot of captures that can happen in the position, so what would you consider here as black? Because this is an idea that he missed and I didn't consider deeply. I guess I should cover this, but it doesn't really matter. So. Do you guys have any ideas?
I mean, the knight takes would be like, I would probably think to do that as black, but maybe also bishop b7, like I'm
yes.
maybe going to take, I'm just going to let you take, I'm going to get my bishop on the diagonal.
This is a very important subject in chess because a lot of times we only think about captures, and obviously we have to consider captures, especially checks, captures, and threads, right? But whenever you make a trade, you want to make sure that it's beneficial for you in some way. Because if black takes right here on e4, as we mentioned, this only helps me with white because my bishop now goes to a better square. I'm gaining a tempo on this rook right here. I may have some ideas in the future of bringing my bishop to c6 because the king still is 2 moves away from castling, right? So trading on e4 would benefit white. But as black, you would want to make a move that forces white to trade in terms that are good for black, if that makes sense. So bishop to b7 would be that move, and it is what my opponent played in the game. However, after knight takes c5, which was my idea, how would you recapture? How would you recapture here? Oh, and c4 was an interesting suggestion from the chat. Sorry, let me just go back 1 second. c4 was an interesting suggestion from the chat, but I think that knight takes and bishop takes works because obviously if you take directly here on c4, then knight on e4 is hanging. But if you take on f6 first, then there's not going to be any problems. So after knight to e4, bishop to b7, knight takes c5, how would you recapture here? Okay, we got 2 suggestions online for bishop takes c5. What would you guys think?
Is the idea behind taking with the bishop? I mean, you are doing like an undeveloped piece for a pretty strong piece, and then you have the tempo of the light squared bishop with the knight.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's you want to give up the bishop pair though.
That's the thing. When I was thinking about these positions and the possible recaptures that my opponent had, I didn't think too deeply about bishop takes c5 because I thought, oh, my opponent is giving up the bishop pair by doing this, right? But after bishop takes c5, d takes c5, knight takes c5, all of a sudden this bishop right here, as mentioned, is under a lot of pressure. You know, like if bishop goes to c2 or something, you can already run out of any of the problems by trading queens. You have this idea with b3. You can castle next move. There is no longer any pressure on the king because the bishop developed already. And in this endgame, black is not going to have any problem because also this bishop on c1 does not have the chance to activate itself. So you can't really play with the pair of bishops as you would usually want in an endgame. So this idea was very clever. Bishop takes c5. And it's something that I did not consider when I was, you know, going over this position. I think there are some ways for the position to be equal, but I have to be the one that's being careful, and that's not what you want with white. So knight takes c5. My opponent actually took with the knight. But the thing is that after knight takes c5, pawn takes c5, bishop takes c5, I already felt like I had something to play on for. And if we look at this position, the structure is symmetrical, right? So we have pawns on the same files. The only difference would be the fact that this king right here hasn't castled yet, and I have already caused some weaknesses with a4, b4, right? So that's kind of the one thing that you have to keep in mind. But also already I was starting to come up with some ideas to seize the initiative. So if you were playing here with white, what would be like one square that you want to control, or like one idea that you would want to go for? There is no one right answer only, but there is a pretty strong idea. Someone in the chat is suggesting e4, which is very strong, right? Like if you were able to play e4, it would be pretty strong. The only problem is that in this particular moment, they could take the pawn. So what can we do in preparation for that? Huh?
Move the rook.
Yeah, we can go rook to e1. That's one of the moves that I was considering in this position. In this particular case, though, I felt like if I'm going to play with e4, I want my rook to stay on f1 so that f2 is always guarded. Because I am willingly opening the diagonal of this bishop. And I had another idea. I wanted to play this move queen to e2. With the same goal of playing e4. But first of all, I'm getting my queen out of the d file, so we're not going to have queen trades if my bishop ever moves. And at the same time, I am preparing for this e4, possibly e5 afterwards. And if this bishop gets out, I can think about moving my rook to the d file, right? Because I'm opening up that square for the rook in the future.
What about queen c2?
Queen c2 is another idea that makes a lot of sense. I just didn't want to run into the open file. So after something like, well, technically you could castle because of queen takes. So that's a thing. But I also didn't want to run into rook c8 and problems with the queen in the future. So queen to e2. So far I'm making very natural moves, and my opponent already is starting to worry. He played queen to e7 with the idea that if I played e4, then he's going to play e5. So he doesn't want me to play e5 myself, he would rather stop it. But as we know, every pawn move creates a weakness, right? So after this move, pawn to e5, what could be a way for me to try and go after the weaknesses that are left behind in the position? Yes, f5 is one weakness, so how do we get there? It's the question of how do we keep improving our pieces?
Is it too early to play knight h4?
No, knight h4 makes the most sense. And the idea of this move is that the knight is getting into f5, right? So the whole point is that we have knight f5 coming up, and all of a sudden the position becomes uncomfortable for black to play. Because, for example, if castles happens, then we run into some issues after like bishop to g5. Actually, bishop to g5 or knight to f5, both of them look pretty strong. Bishop to g5, I would say, since knight to f5 is not going anywhere. And already you're getting a lot of pieces near the king. Maybe this queen can jump into the attack in the future. It's just a really nice outpost for the knight to have, this f5 square. Probably it would have been better to just give up this square than what my opponent ended up doing, because he played the move g6. And this is exactly what I wanted. I'm already inducing weaknesses into the position. So, especially since the king is planning to castle short, there's no way that the king can castle long. It just looks super weak. Since the king is planning to castle short, I already have my bishop on the lookout, and squares around the king are going to be weak. So, what can we do here? There are some famous games, in my opinion. Like I'm remembering some games right now where, you know, similar setup with like the pawn structure on the side, and then g6 is played, and then there's one move that comes right after for white.
I mean, you could prevent them from castling permanently with bishop h6.
Yeah.
That's like strong. I would probably like. It seems more appealing bishop g5 just to pin them back.
That's interesting because I played bishop g5, yeah. But the best move is bishop h6. So, yes, bishop to h6 makes a lot of sense, just preventing the king from castling, right? And the one thing that I think I was concerned about for some reason was like knight to h5, maybe, you know, with some ideas of, you know, putting pressure onto this knight on h4 right here, maybe some ideas of the knight jumping to f4. I think this is what I didn't like about the position. But there is actually a very clever idea in this moment. Considering that the king cannot go here, all of the pieces are very uncoordinated, and you know, we have almost like a blow to the black king. This is one of those moments where like magically, not magically, but you know, all of a sudden there is like a tactic that Yes, bishop to b5, and the idea is that if pawn takes, queen takes, where is this king going to go, right? Because if it goes to d8, already it looks like a death sentence. You can play with rook to d1, you can play with rook to c1. There's basically no way that the king is gonna be safe. And if queen to d7, for example, there is already queen takes c5. And this is crashing for white. So yeah, this bishop to b5 is a very clever idea. Also, if knight to what move could be played? If like knight to f3, let's say knight to f4, you still have like some ideas with bishop to b5. So it's not even just in that turn, it's even in the future turns. But yeah, that would have been a very clever way for me to finish the game. I didn't do that. I just played bishop to g5. And I did end up winning, but it took way longer. Because after... wait, was it here? Oh, no. I played bishop to... I played knight to f3. I played knight to f3. For some reason, I thought I played bishop to g5. But I guess bishop to g5, there can be h6, and that was kind of the worrying thing. Maybe h6, and then I'm not sure where this bishop is going. Maybe I have to go back to e3. So it was, I guess that was the whole point. That was the whole point of knight to h4. Knight to h4 to play g6, and then knight to f3, and at least now I can play bishop to g5 next turn. I'm not sure why I thought that my knight was in trouble on h4. Now that I look back on it, it doesn't really seem like it. Maybe I saw some ghosts in that position. But bishop to g5 is coming, and at least I have some control over the direct squares around the king. King to g7 was played, and now the only pieces that are not part of the position are the two rooks, right? So rook to c1, it has already some ideas of bishop takes f6, and the queen cannot take because the bishop on c5 is hanging. And after rook to d8, bishop to c4, already putting pressure on this pawn on f7 since the rook moved out of the f8 square. And after bishop to b6, this is another moment where I was like trying to set up my position. Already I have very nice bishops. I have a rook that could get into the game whenever possible. I just need to gain some more control of the position, because it would be really nice if I could do something like queen to e3 and get my queen involved. I could maybe have ideas of the bishop coming to h6. I just need my pieces to get to my opponent, right? So what could be a move to do that right now? And I believe that this is one of those critical moments in the game. There are some really clever ideas in the chat. So if we look at the black pieces, which one is the one that is annoying us the most? Right, so we want to try and make it go somewhere else, right? If not, then at least we want to get some space.
I guess I'm struggling with that issue. If I try to trade bishops, is the performance of getting out of bishop on g5, like do I leave the pressure on that knight and trade? That's hard for me to understand.
Yeah, so we want to keep this bishop. We don't really want to trade it off. It's a really strong bishop. It controls a lot of squares that this bishop cannot reach. So well, it runs into some problems because since there is not a pin here anymore, this pawn on e4 is going to be hanging.
Oh, yeah.
So the bishop is perfectly placed right here on g5. And the move that I decided to play in this position was a5. Why? I just simply want to get this bishop out of this diagonal, because I want to put my queen on e3, and I want to control more squares in my position. At the same time, if the bishop goes to c7, which is another valid option, like for example, actually no, bishop to c7 is what happened in the game. I meant like if the bishop goes to a7 to try and continue with the control right here on e3, then this is completely fine, but at least I'm gonna try and fight for like c7 ways to enter in the position. So I can go like bishop to d3, let's say, already have some ideas maybe of like bishop f6 and rook c7, try to come up with something like that. Basically this move is just gaining space. I also always have some pressure on this pawn on a6, so I'm gonna try to make the most out of that in this position. Basically, I already created some weaknesses on the position of my opponent. I'm putting pressure onto those weaknesses, but my opponent is also defending. And a lot of times when that happens, you want to create another weakness, preferably on the opposite side of the board. Or you want to gain space on the opposite side of the board. You want to create something else that you have going for yourself so that it's difficult for the opponent to, take care of both threats at the same time. Yeah, the principle of two weaknesses. You see that more often than not with like weak pawns, for example, or like if there is an isolated pawn that you're attacking. But it also works for positions where it looks like you have the initiative, but you don't know what the next step is. So that's what I was trying to do with a5. And the idea is that I'm also forcing my opponent to make decisions. And this is very difficult because for me, I have the initiative, so I can be a little bit more carefree with my choices. But my opponent does not have that liberty because there could be more tactics or more ideas or more threats that they really need to consider. Otherwise, my attack is working, right? So practically, it also makes a lot of sense. And after I played this move a5, my opponent went bishop to c7. But after bishop to c7, I have achieved everything that I wanted with queen to e3. He decided to take on h5 now, and I played bishop to h6, king goes back down, and knight to g5. And now it's almost impossible to protect this pawn right here on f7. And if I manage to capture that pawn, basically the safety of the castle king is collapsing, right? Because I have this bishop putting pressure, and so is this knight. The pieces are distracted on the other side of the board, not being able to help. And so my opponent played rook to f8, but after I become an exchange up in the position, it becomes very clear how to play, especially when I have this move rook to a1, putting pressure onto this bishop right here on a5, and the pawn that's behind it on a6. Yeah, black still wishes that the pawn was still on g7. What happens if knight g4? Oh, knight g4 in this moment. If knight g4, I can just go queen to h3. Like, there are no worries with that because this is still a threat, this is still a threat. And if knight takes h6, queen takes h6, h7 is hanging. So even knight to g4 with a fork is not going to help black in the position. So after knight to g5, rook to f8 takes, bishop goes back. I just decided to play h3 because I didn't want the knight to jump over here to g4 with some threats onto this this knight right here on g5. But afterwards, the position became very easy for me to play because I'm just an exchange up. So I'm just going to show you the end of the game. But after bishop to c2, b3, I kept putting pressure onto the black pieces and eventually managed to capture that. Take care of the coordination of my pieces, making sure that every single one of them is protected. Rook to a1, rook to a8, trying to get rook to a1. Thankfully, I have bishop to f1 and a bunch of other things. And finally, g4, and my opponent resigned. So, some takeaways from this game. First of all, try to come up with an idea for the attack that you're making. For me, in particular, my brain started thinking about plans after I played this move queen to e2, because I knew that I wanted to play with e4 and e5 if my opponent lets me. And afterwards, I noticed that while trying to avoid some of my threats, my opponent was making weaknesses in his position, like e5, like g6. And the whole point is that you're able to put pressure on them, attack them. You can play on the other side of the board, try to create some other weaknesses. And like with this move a5. And at some point, you're putting your opponent under so much pressure that they're going to collapse somehow. And in this particular case, it was with bishop to c7, queen to e3, bishop takes a5, because I managed to play bishop to h6, knight to g5, and the position is completely winning. After this, what you need to do, especially if you have material advantage, is just to make sure that you win the game. That's still a tricky part, depending on the game and the position. But it's a lot easier than having to play for the advantage. So I hope that you're able to do that part once you have the material advantage. But when it comes to developing the attack, these are some of the steps that you want to take. You want to look at the biggest weaknesses that the opponent has. Like, for example, another thing to mention is how this rook moved away from f8 to d8, and all of a sudden f7 became super weak. Bringing all of the pieces into the attack, all of the white pieces were doing their thing. The only one maybe not was this rook right here on f1, but it guarded f2 when it needed to. And even at the cost of a pawn, you want to make sure that you have initiative in your position. So yeah. Any questions about this game? Okay. So if there are no questions, I'm gonna jump over to the next example. Oh, thank goodness. I thought it was going to start from the final position and we're gonna get spoilers. But this next game is another very interesting game that I had in a summer tournament. This one happened in 2024. It was the Biel Chess Festival, and it's one of those tournaments that I also really, really enjoyed because the time control was 2 hours for 40 moves, everything with a 30-second increment. 2 hours for 40 moves, then a move 40, you get an extra 50 minutes, and then a move 60, you get an extra 15 minutes. So the games would just go on forever. And for me, that was fun. For others, I don't know. But I enjoyed it. One of my games in the tournament went on for 8 hours, and I have never, done anything like that. And I thought it was really fun.
8 hours?
Yeah, it was from 2 p.m. It was from 2 p.m. To 9:50, more or less, yeah. Because I got to my hotel at 9:55. It was like a small town, so it was like 5-minute walk. And I checked my phone in my hotel. It was like 9:55, and every single restaurant closed at 10. So I was like running, trying to get something. But it was yeah. I don't know. I enjoyed that. So if we can make that happen in St. Louis, like a 24-hour chess game or something, I'll be down.
In the opposite direction of everyone's here.
Yeah, that is true. Like rapid, blitz, bullet, no. We're going to have 24-hour long games. We're gonna have marathons. I'll promote all of it. But right. So, okay, let's get started with the last game of the tournament. And something that I noticed, because these tournaments are so long and so extensive and so difficult. By the last round, everyone just wants to finish quickly, right? And this game thankfully only took like 2 hours or something, so that was really good. During my 8-hour game, I drank so much Red Bull. Funny thing is, I don't really drink Red Bull. I just like the Formula One team, so that's why I wear this jacket. But knight to f3 is how I chose to start my game. For the most part, I'm a d4 player, but I had 3 tournaments back to back, and I was like, let me just do something slightly different and make sure that my opponent is not prepping for me or something. So knight to f3, knight to f6, I play with g3, bishop to g2, and would you look at that, I eventually transpose into a Catalan. c5 was played, and I had actually just briefly checked some lines in my hotel room before this, and I decided to play the move c4. I believe there are some interesting ideas here, like for example, c takes d4, you can castle, and this is completely fine. Because if takes, I think you have some ideas with queen to a4, you may have some ideas with queen take d4, and the whole point is that you get back this pawn on c4, and then your pieces are slightly more active, so something like takes, and then, I don't know, let's say like bishop c5, let's say there's like knight to b5, knight to a6, and then you can play with like knight to c3, I think knight to d2 is also possible. But basically you get enough compensation because the pieces get out, and then eventually you take this pawn on c4, you can come and take it this way, you can play knight to a4, get the bishop out, and then bring the rooks over. It's nothing to worry about. Well, on the other hand, the black pieces are kind of uncoordinated. So I checked that briefly, but my opponent decided to play with knight to c6. And after knight to c6, I thought, well, let me be the one trading right here. And the whole point is that if c takes d5, e takes d5, which is what I thought my opponent would play, I was planning to castle and just play against this pawn right here on d5. We basically get like a Tarash, and I have had that with the black side of the game in the past, so I was completely fine with this. But my opponent decided to take with a knight, which was a very peculiar choice, I thought, because you usually want to take back on d5 with the pawn. So after knight takes d5, I just chose to castle, bishop to e7, And now how can we start forcing the opponent to lose time? E4 I think is one very nice idea. I think this is completely playable, like knight to b6, and well, what would you like to do now? Because you can play d takes c5. Something like this maybe, and then maybe have a slightly more pleasant endgame because control some space with the pawn on e4. But something that I was trying to come up with in the position was a way to, you know, take as much time away from my opponent. And e4 is one idea. There was one other move that I had thought about in this moment. And every move should come with a tempo because the king is about to castle, right? So the bishop just moved to e7. And usually you don't want to move the same piece twice, right? Yeah, so in this position, I just took on c5. And with that, I'm basically forcing my opponent to take back the pawn. And after bishop takes c5, how can we continue? Again, trying to gain tempos with every move. Yeah, queen to c2. And then we just took here on c5, forcing the bishop to move. Now queen to c2, forcing the bishop to move once again. And not only that, we got the queen away from the d file, so we're avoiding trades. And already we can start thinking about e4 in the future. So queen to c2, bishop to e7 was played. And here there are a few moves that you can play. Yeah, rook d1 is the most natural one. I don't remember why I didn't like this move. I think maybe I thought about castles and if e4, knight b4, and I didn't want to deal with this because if rook takes, knight takes. It could have been this, there is just queen e2 and the position is fine. I was just a little bit prophylactic and I decided to play the move a3, which is also completely fine here because I'm taking away knight b4 and e4 is coming next move. So the king finally castled, but after e4, knight to b6, I have the position of my dreams, basically. Rook to d1, another move with tempo. And it's difficult to know what to do because if the queen goes to c7, let's say, this is already a really big mistake because bishop to f4 comes with a tempo. And not only that, after e5, I can actually just take here. Because if knight takes, then queen takes c7, the queen was pinned and it's not protected. So queen to c7, already completely winning for white. So my opponent played bishop to d7, but this is already, you know, running into a pin. So it's something else that you wouldn't want to experience as black. How do we keep increasing pressure in the position? Bishop to e3. Threaten to take this knight, putting more pressure onto this bishop on d7 because the queen is going to be the only piece defending it since the knight on b6 is going to be eliminated. And at the same time, we're bringing our pieces into the game. I just chose to play bishop to e3, but knight to c3 also made a lot of sense. As long as we get the pieces out, the position is good. Rook to c8, queen to e2, just getting the queen out of the way. Queen to c7, and now knight to c3. Knight to c3 has some ideas because the knight is starting to jump right here to b5. And if the queen goes back to b8, then we have bishop takes b6, a takes b6, rook takes d7. So once again, every move comes with a tempo. a6, not possible because bishop b6, once again, bishop on d7 is hanging. So even though the position looks compact and almost safe for black, there are a lot of dangers that you're going to have to keep in mind. In this moment, rook to d8 was played. but after knight to b5, queen to b8, and I decided to play a4. And the idea basically is that I'm just gonna play a5. I'm gonna force this knight to go back. Every single move that I'm making is expanding in the position, pushing my opponent farther back. Funny enough, that move was kind of an inaccuracy. There was like another really nice idea that I had here, which was bishop to a3, which looks like a very strange move. But you already can start thinking about potential plans of bishop to g5, and if bishop takes, knight takes, already putting pressure onto these pawns. The queen can jump over to h5, e6 might be weak, so bishop to h3, interesting move. I just didn't really think about it. a4 made a lot more sense to me. And after knight to a8, you can already tell that something is going wrong in the position if you have to make the move knight to a8. And at the same time, it's difficult to know what to do with black. And one idea that my opponent had was to try and bring the knight over to c7 and at least try and get rid of this really strong knight on b5. Yeah, someone's saying black's position is not healthy, and I can 100% agree. I decided to play the move e5, basically opening up the last piece that I needed. And this move e5 reminds me a lot of the move a5 in the previous example, where I'm trying to push the opponent's pieces back. I'm trying to control as much space as possible, and I'm trying to improve the placement of my pieces, because the whole point of a5 in the previous game was to get my queen to d3. In this case, I'm playing e5 to help this bishop, right? And the whole idea is that knight takes e5 is not possible because a7 is hanging, right? So you can take with a knight, and the position is once again just collapsing. You might also have some ideas like rook takes d7 takes and bishop takes, so that you don't run into this in the position. And yes, another idea is something that's being suggested in the chat, the fact that e5 supports d6, so my knight can end up landing here in the future, right? Especially if a move like knight to c7, I would really be considering knight to d6. But my opponent played the move a6, and a6 is only enticing me to go forward even more. Knight to d6 was played, and here my opponent played bishop takes d6, did not want to deal with the pressure. E takes d6, and here she played the move e5. And e5 might make a little bit of sense. You want to gain some space back, you want to develop this bishop, maybe to g4, and you're hoping to somehow open up the way for this bishop so that d6 becomes a really weak pawn, yeah? But e5 also creates a lot of weaknesses. Similarly to g6 in the previous game, there are a lot of weaknesses. So what is one move that we have here as white? Also keeping in mind the pieces that are completely stuck on the other side of the board. Yes, a lot of people in the chat are commenting that there are no pieces defending the black king. So what can we do in order to capitalize that? Mm-hmm. Yes. So the move in the best move in the position is knight to g5. And there are just so many ideas here, because you're putting pressure on f7, you're putting pressure on h7, the queen can now jump up, and you're opening up the way for the bishop, right? So if f6 is played, bishop to d5 is coming, and black is in a lot of problems. So f6 cannot be played. Something that I was considering in this position maybe was bishop to f5, trying to control the damage. But my opponent ended up playing g6, another g6 in these games. So g6, the idea is that the queen can't go over to h5. But what can we do now? Yeah, bishop to d5 is putting in a lot of pressure into this position. I believe also, let me see if I am remembering this. I believe also knight takes f7 was a choice. And this is something that I was thinking about for a long time at the board. And then I realized I don't need to do it. Like I can go all out, but I also don't need to, I don't need to get into this. Because after king takes, I have this move bishop to h6. And it's a very crazy move. The whole point is that, for example, if the king goes back to g8, I already have some ideas of queen c4 and queen to f7, basically just breaking into the position. I also have some ideas of bishop takes d5 and bishop takes c6, and I'm taking right here on e5 with queen to g7 checkmate. So this is another thing. So bishop to h6 was a move that I was considering. I think bishop to f5 was like a problem for me for some reason, something like bishop to f5, bishop d5, and king to e8, trying to run away. But I also thought, so knight takes f7 is completely playable, but I also thought bishop to d5 is like possibly stronger, because how are you going to defend all of the weaknesses in the position? Bishop to e8 is what my opponent played. Rook to f8, it runs into the same issues after queen to f3. Rook to d7, and now I just play knight to e4. And it's basically impossible to handle the position. And the thing is that in the previous game, at least the dark square bishop was on the other side of the board. In this one, there's no dark square bishop. So there's literally no way to stop queen to f6 and bishop to h6. Also because look at the situation of this queen right here on b8. So there is basically nothing that you can do. Knight to f6 is coming as well, with the idea to take on d7. And after rook to d8, I just play queen to f6, and my opponent resigned. Because there is not much, actually no, I'm lying, she didn't resign. She played knight to d4, and after rook takes d4, she resigned. Because I am just going to play bishop to h6 next move, and there's no way to stop it. Knight to d4, the idea is bishop h6, knight to f5. So just didn't want to allow that. And also after queen to f6, if rook takes d6, it might seem like black is almost getting away with it, but we have this bishop takes f7. Bishop takes f7, rook takes f7, completely crashing. Sorry, bishop takes f7, rook d6, and the position is completely crashing. So yeah, two examples. I think the ideas can coordinate or correlate in some way. You want to already, out of the opening, start considering what your assets are in the position. If you can gain time on your opponent's moves, try to make every move with some sort of threat to stop the opponent from consolidating. And after that, you want to create some weaknesses in the position, get all of your pieces involved, and have some sort of expansion to the point where your pieces are comfortably moving around, coordinated, shuffling in order to continue with the different threats that the position is giving. Because for the first part of the game, we were super focused on the queen side, right? Then we managed to get all of the black pieces into really bad squares. Then we switched over to the king side with a move like e5, knight to g5. We want to make sure that we're always putting pressure onto the opponent. So yeah, any last questions?
When you play black,
Mm-hmm.
against d4, you play semi-Slav?
I don't play the semi-Slav. I play Grunfeld, and sometimes I also play the Queen's Gambit accepted. Yeah, so if I don't want to go all out with the Grunfeld, I might play something a bit more safe, I guess, with the Queen's Gambit accepted, which is very solid. There are still some crazy lines, but it's a lot more solid than the Grunfeld. So yeah.
That, I feel like I might not be
Mm-hmm.
when you can. I feel like the semi-Slav is when you can transpose into kind of like slowly, like you can get to that structure. Because that line that you showed us at the beginning with the
Mm-hmm.
e4 right away, the semi-Slav one.
Yes.
Right? Is that playable like only in that order, or can you kind of get away with that?
Yes, only in that move order, because otherwise there's a knight on f6. Yes, so the semi-Slav would usually be d5, c6, knight f6, e6. But it's basically when you have that triangle of c6, d5, e6. Yeah, with the bishop inside. Yeah. All right, so with that, I think we're ending for today. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. You're going to be seeing a lot more of me, unfortunately, for the next few weeks. And bye-bye.
Where Dennis?
It's a clash of kings as the nation's top players battle it out across 3 time controls. Champions Showdown, The Kings, begins on March 4th in the chess capital of America, St. Louis, Missouri. 6 of the nation's best will compete in 3 time controls across 3 days for a $250,000 prize fund. Featuring 5-time U.S. champion Hikaru Nakamura, 4-time U.S. champion Fabiano Caruana, 3-time U.S. champion Wesley So, and established St. Louis veterans Levon Aronian, Lanier Dominguez, and Ray Robson. These players will battle it out to see who is the best of the best across semi-classical, rapid, and blitz time controls. Join us to kick off 2025 and see who takes the title in this action-packed event. Follow these exciting games and new format on the St. Louis Chess Club YouTube and Twitch channels.